Welcome back. For our next session, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Aaron Sheehan-Dean, whose discussion today is the cultural origins of the Civil War. Dr. Sheehan-Dean comes to us from Louisiana State University, where he is the Fred C. Frey Professor of Southern Studies and Chairman of the History Department. He teaches courses on 19th century U.S. history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Southern history. Among his outstanding publications is the award-winning The Calculus of Violence, How Americans Fought the Civil War. Dr. Aaron Sheehan-Dean, welcome to the podium and to the American Civil War Museum.
Good morning. I will take us up to lunch, but I promise not to go into lunch time proper. Rob, thank you for organizing this and inviting me to participate. To Kelly, who has organized this, it's been flawless for us. I am also going to be baffled. Do I just press forward and it goes forward? Is that the idea on the remote? Yes. Okay. I better not have to go back because there does not seem to be oh, there is a back. Sorry. All right, it's great to be here in this space in particular, which is a magnificent space. It's wonderful that the museum has made these spaces into this kind of intellectual community, and that there are so many people here wanting to talk about the Civil War. I spent a long time in Virginia. I'm in Louisiana now, and it's hard to get 100 people in to talk about the Civil War. 30 we can usually do, so this is inspiring. A little bit of background on what I'm going to talk about today, and then we will start off. This is a project that is probably about 2/3 of the way finished, so I'm eager to hear your thoughts about what I say, the questions and the comments, the quarrels, as Manisha invited as well, so that I can think through exactly what it is I'm doing. This is a book that grew out of a book that I published in 2020. If you publish a book in 2020, you are guaranteed that you and your mother have read it, and nobody else. It was categorically the worst year to ever publish a book in the last, millennium or something. So that was a book about the kind of global context for thinking about the Civil War, and I compared it to things like the Polish Rebellion of 1861 and the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Rebellion of 1857. And so I was looking at newspapers and at the rhetoric that Americans used to talk about the Civil War. And in the process of doing that, I realized that they were talking a lot about the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. And that was not something that I knew much about. As a Civil War historian, we really only have responsibility for 4 years. From 1861 to 1865, it drives all my colleagues, particularly the Europeanists, bananas, because they all teach hundreds of years or thousands of years at a sweep. And so I started to return back in time, and the more I dug in on this question, the more I found there was to think about. So the talk and the book project is about the historical consciousness of people who fought the Civil War. Over the last decade and a half, we've had a huge growth in the field of Civil War memory, much of it thanks to my colleague Carrie Janey. And so we've looked mostly at the ways that we as Americans today have remembered the Civil War. What we have done less of, I would argue, is think about the historical consciousness and the memories of the people who fought the Civil War. These are people who were highly literate. The rate for the United States is something like 90%, actually a little bit above that in 1850 already. They're a highly literate population, and they have a historical consciousness. And so my argument is that they are using that historical consciousness to think through the American Civil War. And in particular, they are using the 17th century, what they called the English Civil Wars, what historians today would call the Wars of Three Nations, because they take place in England, Scotland, and Ireland mostly simultaneously. So in the process of thinking through and trying to understand how Americans use this, what I uncovered, or what I think I see now, is the way that we can see the kind of intellectual architecture of the American Civil War in the ways that they talked about history. So that's kind of the larger project. Today's talk is really focused on Civil War causation and the ways that Northerners and Southerners were really talking about themselves and really I should say the ways that fire eaters and kind of New England abolitionists were talking about themselves in the decade or decade and a half before the war. And they have very, very different readings of the 17th century, which will emerge in just a minute. And then there's a kind of a third memory or a third interpretation of the past that emerges really at the moment the war starts. And so I want to try to talk through all of these today very quickly. I will give you as much history as you need of the 17th century. My great fear is that somebody out here actually studies the 17th century, in which case my history will look woefully inadequate. But I have been reading a lot and trying to understand. Part of the problem, I will say up front, is that I've been mostly reading 19th century histories of the 17th century, which I don't recommend a steady diet of that. There's great writing today on the 17th century, on the English Civil Wars, and on how we should understand them in our world today. The 19th century histories of the 17th century were, of course, just like ours are, partial and incomplete and often quite political. And so part of what's interesting here is to think through, at a kind of several step remove, the ways that people of the past weaponized and adopted a political history in a very deliberate way. And they're doing this certainly with the 17th century. So the people that we're talking about here, the kind of chief characters of the 17th century, if the English Civil Wars didn't immediately ring a bell from your Western Civ class, is Charles I, the first English king and the only English king ever executed, and then his sort of chief opponent in the war, Oliver Cromwell, who emerges out of Parliament as an unexpectedly capable military leader and leads a group that I'm going to generalize as the Puritans. At the time, they would have also been called the Parliamentarians. Those are sometimes different communities. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to kind of lump them together, and we can talk about why they might be different. But it is a way of anchoring their identities. That is, for Americans fighting the Civil War, both Northerners and Southerners, I will submit that they anchor themselves in this 17th century identity. I'm going to make three kind of quick macro points about the significance of what I'm hoping to argue, and then I'll talk sort of sequentially about Southerners and their Cavalier heritage, or what they claim is a Cavalier heritage, Northerners and the kind of Puritan legacy, and then this sort of middle ground that's articulated really by Lincoln and Northern moderates that tries to sort of thread the needle here. So the first point is that these competing analogies that Americans use fuel sectional animosity and ultimately hasten war. I think that as professional historians, we tend to believe and to hope that part of the purpose of the study of history is precisely to avoid bloodletting like happened between 1861 and 1865. But one of the lessons that I'm beginning to draw from this is that the ways that people used history actually facilitated conflict. It did not retard that conflict in the 1850s. It also leads us to, I think, question the slipperiness, or to be aware of the slipperiness of metaphorical thinking when we use it in history. And we use it all the time, and we use analogical thinking all the time. Even if we're not explicitly making comparisons between one place and another, we're almost always comparing and thinking across time. The question earlier about the ways that religious leaders in the 19th century, Pennington used religious language in the ways that Martin Luther King Jr. used religious language to make political change, right? That's sort of essential to our use of history as a way to think through our world, and it was in the 19th century. But I've come to see this as a kind of cautionary tale, and one of the places to see this is with Confederates who put their faith in a monarch, wind up perilously close to endorsing monarchy itself. They wind up in a position that's in many respects hostile to democracy, and that's a dangerous thing for them in a country that had already promulgated and established the most advanced democracy in the world. In 1860, it's not our democracy in the United States, but it is nonetheless a democratic system. Fire eaters craft an argument based on that 17th century that demands national autonomy, and importantly, one that obscures slavery's role in the conflict. So I'm not arguing today that the cultural conflict between the North and the South, waged mostly through newspapers and journals and speeches, that somehow caused the Civil War. Civil War historians today are reasonably clear that conflicts over slavery caused the war. But I do think that the rhetoric is important to take seriously on its own terms and to think through in particular the ways in which rhetoric can mobilize and exacerbate conflict or the ways that it can diminish conflict. And then the last point is that the moderates who are called to action, and I would say somewhat reluctantly, they are nonetheless committed as a result of their reading of the past to a hard war, and a war that requires deep perseverance. So part of the study, I hope, also answers the question of why Northerners persist in the war, particularly past 1863, before Gettysburg and Vicksburg at a very low point when the casualties were dramatically higher than anybody had expected at the beginning of the war. And so thinking through the decision of Northerners to stay in the conflict, part of their decision there stems from how they read the 17th century and what that experience was like. So, what of these latter-day Royalists? I want to start with Confederates and think through a little bit of how they develop an argument around their supposed Cavalier heritage. And there is a kind of popular vision of Cavaliers, given to us most famously by Mark Twain, right? Twain famously blames the Civil War on Sir Walter Scott. Which is, like all things Twain, sort of accurate and ironic and also funny. That's not the history that I'm talking about here, because Twain is really talking about a kind of literary representation. My argument is that they actually commit themselves to the history of the 17th century, and in particular this Royalist history. And it is a Royalist history that endorses hierarchy, that believes in the centrality and the overwhelming importance of an ordered society. So DeBow's Review publishes a whole series of articles over the 1850s and into the Civil War. DeBow's, of course, is one of the most famous and well-known of the business and kind of political journals of the antebellum world. And they publish a series on this question of the Cavalier and the Puritan. In this context here, the Cavalier is the builder, the social architect, the institutionalist, the conservator, the advocate of rational liberty and the support of authority, all the good things, as against the licentiousness and the morbid impulse of unregulated passion and unenlightened sentiment. That's what they were facing. That's what the Cavaliers were facing in the 17th century, according to this interpretation. That is, this is what the Puritans brought to the English Civil Wars. These were the parties from which sprang the two nationalities that now divide the empire of the American continent. Right? And the use of nationalities there is very deliberate because we're in a moment in the mid-19th century in which nationalities deserve and merit their own nation states. This is a novel form of political organization, but think of the creation of Italy in 1860. The building up, the slow dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. Greece, of course, gets its independence in 1830, 31. There's some actual historian that will remember that date. That process of naturalizing the creation of nation states is part of how this history is put into action. It is an invented tradition, the way that we talk as historians about how nations put themselves together, and I think that will emerge more fully here in just a minute. The endorsement of hierarchy is consistent with the way that Confederates are framing the Confederate enterprise from the very beginning. And here I refer, of course, to Alexander Stephens's famous Cornerstone Address, in which he establishes unequivocally that the Confederacy is founded on the idea of inequality, that the world biologically is unequal, and so the government should fit itself to that fundamental biological reality and not try to somehow pretend like equality is the norm. This commitment to hierarchy that emerges in the language around royalism and the Cavaliers is, I would argue, perfectly consistent with the ideology that's emerging out of the pro-slavery theory of the 1840s and the 1850s. The Puritans are fanatics in this reading. That is, the historical Puritans are the fanatics. The Puritan is the ultra-liberty man of the world, both in religion and politics. He is not willing to be under authority as authority of God or man. His pride of individual right is so extreme that he must have all rule and all authority and power. Now, we might observe today the irony of a slaveholder condemning the idea of absolute authority, right? The ironies and the contradictions here are many. But what I'm drawing your attention to here is the ways in which, by configuring themselves and setting themselves in this royalist tradition, they wind up opposed to liberty itself. This kind of language, the Richmond Daily Whig is one of the most persistent the users of the analogy of the Cavalier Puritan language and of 17th century history generally. Sorry, actually it's not the Whig. The Whig in this case has a very good one. The Richmond Daily Dispatch is really the kind of leading journal that is historically informed and uses this language throughout the conflict. It is, I would argue, a kind of a sort of pseudo-ethnic lineage, and this is the trajectory as Confederates explain it. The Norman invasion of the 11th century leads to the Cavaliers of the 17th century, who then populate the southern colonies exclusively, and they create the Confederates of the mid-19th century. It is a linear and exact science in this vision. There is, of course, a contrary reading of how this history goes that Northerners offer. One of the problems that this generates for the Confederacy is in the world of class. Right, so that one of the chief challenges for Confederates was, of course, trying to convince non-slaveholders that a war on behalf of slavery was a war they should be invested in. And there's a great deal of effort that's gone in historical scholarship to trying to explain how that process went. The Confederacy has plenty of class conflict. I tend to argue that they were successful at convincing non-slaveholders to participate. But Confederate leaders are deeply aware that the class tensions within the antebellum South can become, in the wartime, a terrible chasm. And so they are alert to this. Nonetheless, the language of the 17th century pulls them into it. So here's, this quote was just too good to resist, on the kind of physiognomy of the differences in the inheritance between Cavaliers and Yankees. This is the Southern Literary Messenger, which also uses this, they use these analogies often. There is, however, even yet a frankness about the Norman British yeoman, a squareness of build, an independence of gait, a loftiness of stature, a boldness of countenance, a darkness of complexion, read also Confederates, that you would look for in vain in the namby-pamby, pigeon-breasted, dull-visaged, pale-faced, Gosselin-rounded Anglo-Saxon of the day. Right, just this week, in fact, I found another one of these that I have to put in the footnote because there's only so much of this I probably need, that actually talks about the smell of these sort of distinct breeds, right? So it's an incredibly literal and, of course, not very scientific vision of how descent works. Back to the problem of class. Jefferson Davis draws on these analogies as well. This is an address that he offers to the Mississippi legislature in late 1862. Northerners, he says, are a traditionless and homeless race from the time of Cromwell to the present moment. They have been the disturbers of the peace of the world. A people whose ancestors Cromwell had gathered from the bogs and fens of Ireland and Scotland. Right, so never mind the kind of cracker hypothesis or, Paddy Griffith's Attack and Die, books that argue that the Celtic kind of tradition was more prominent in the South. Davis here is making the argument that the North is composed of basically the offscourings of these sort of old rancid places, the bogs and fens of Ireland and Scotland, right? He is associating himself, as others in the Confederacy do, with the aristocracy, the nobility of that Cavalier lineage, which is a perilous rhetorical strategy in a place where the class politics are so fraught. And also, of course, at a moment in which, say, Abe Lincoln is elected precisely because of his common origins, right? The wide-awake clubs that build scale model log cabins and sort of drive them around to polling stations to remind Americans of the possibility of somebody from a kind of rural, agricultural, working class coming up into the presidency. So the Republican Party is appealing precisely, and I think precisely kind of cleverly, strategically, to that position of the common man. Confederates are in this position moving in the opposite tradition. What's missing from the Confederate use of the 17th century is as important as what's there, and what's missing is John Milton. So this is John Milton of Paradise Lost. Milton was both a poet during this era. Paradise Lost comes after the wars conclude. He was a part of the regime that Cromwell brings into office. He served as a kind of all-purpose diplomat, translator. He responded to all the diplomatic correspondence that came into the Commonwealth. Cromwell establishes officially a Commonwealth. The monarchy is dissolved by parliamentary law, and then a Commonwealth is created. And Milton is deep in that administration. And as a result of that kind of complicity, although Southerners love his poetry and Paradise Lost is an essential text for them, though obviously more essential for the North, they will not go anywhere near as nonfiction writing. That is, the writing that Milton did as a representative of this parliamentary movement, even though Milton crafts the best language for them. So this is a pamphlet that Milton wrote that's actually published in 1649, right after the execution of the king. He didn't know the king was going to be executed, but it winds up being the best kind of ideological justification for the execution of a king in England. Since the king or magistrate holds his authority of the people, both originally and naturally for their own good in the first place and not his own, then may the people, as oft as they shall judge it for the best, either choose him or reject him, retain him or depose him, though no tyrant, merely by the liberty and right of freeborn men, to be governed as seems to them best. It seems to me there's no better explanation for Confederates of what they are trying to do. That is, as oft as the people shall judge it for their interests, either choose or reject him. The advent, the immediate impulse for secession in 1861 is, of course, Lincoln's election in 1860. And back in 1649, Milton has offered this justification for how a people, and the question of how you constitute a people is, of course, crucially important, though one that both Milton and Confederates elide. They define people largely as propertied white men. But notwithstanding that, under the existing order, Milton is offering a kind of profound intellectual defense of secession. Confederates can't touch it because Milton is associated as a Puritan. And of course, Northerners make a great deal of Paradise Lost itself as the story of the original rebellion. Right? For those not familiar with Paradise Lost, it is the story of Adam and Eve and, in a way, the first anti-hero, who is the devil in that story. And Northerners make great use of that first original rebellion in a kind of rhetorical way to characterize what the Confederates are doing. So Milton and the refusal of Confederates to even kind of look at Milton is part of the irony of trying to promulgate a conservative revolution. Milton is a radical in the 17th century, and his words still look radical in the 19th century. And the Confederates are trying to create, in using revolutionary means, secession is truly revolutionary, the discussion of sort of is reform or change to the constitutional order, reform or revolution? In the North, right, the decision of secession is incontrovertibly revolutionary because it's seeking to overturn the Constitution itself and create a whole new country, except that needs to be somehow a conservative revolution for property, which is a difficult thing to do. All of these, I would argue, produce what we would call today a clash of civilizations argument. That is, the rhetoric of identifying themselves with the 17th century, with the Cavalier side of the 17th century, not even being willing to criticize Charles I, which the Northern moderates find a way sort of in between here. That positions the North and South as sort of polar opposites in this context. And it leaves very little room for any kind of compromise coming through. I would also note that it is a deliberate part of the strategy of obscuring the role of slavery. Here, the Dispatch, in a more typical reference, we have often observed that this contest is a revival of the old war between the Puritans and the Cavalier. They have often observed that. We have never supposed that the existence of slavery is the cause of the long and irritating strife, which has resulted at last in an appeal to arms. Slavery is the occasion, but only the occasion, of that strife. So it is important for us to understand the rhetoric that both sides use, partly because the rhetoric can be used deliberately to conceal, as in this case very obviously and sort of ham-fistedly to conceal what they understand is the real cause of the Civil War. One last point on the Confederates, and I'm probably giving them more than their due here, is that For those of you that don't know the history of the English Civil Wars in the 17th century, they begin 1637, sort of 1640 is usually the date, 2 decades, and they conclude in 1660 with the restoration of the English monarchy. Charles II is brought back and put back onto the throne. Parliament sort of pretends like it didn't dissolve the monarchy, and then England continues its monarchical tradition. For Confederates, that was an object lesson in their own need for perseverance, that God would test, and that if one remained faithful, even remember, it took the conservatives of Britain 20 years, then England, it took them 20 years, but finally after 20 years of perseverance, order and stability was restored and a hierarchy was reestablished. So they believe that that history can kind of model for them their own form of perseverance. I will be shorter on the northern uses of the Puritan analogy. They use that analogy a lot. They do not cement themselves to the kind of 17th century Puritans in the way that Confederates cement themselves to the 17th century Cavaliers. But there is a deep tradition of respect and admiration for the Puritan legacy. David Hall, who I'm quoting here, a contemporary historian, that is our contemporary, and a host of writing over the last several decades, have established the intellectual and social and political importance of the Puritans, particularly in New England, but across the United States, for framing fundamental ways of thinking about both governance and popular life. Part of what the Confederates hate about the Puritans, what they disparage, and part of what Northern radicals admire about the Puritans was, if not their fanaticism, their zealous pursuit of perfection. In the 17th century, what the Puritans were pursuing was a purified church, that is, an Anglican church that to their minds had become too Catholic. The Scottish version of this, the Presbyterians, are also worried. This is the era of iconoclasm, the Presbyterians smashing stained glass windows and stripping crucifixes from churches. They want simply a plain white shell in which to hold service. The equivalent in the 19th century is the campaign against slavery. The sin that we are confronted with in the 19th century, the one that the inheritors of the Puritan legacy, many of the people that Manisha was talking about this morning, they are called to redress their own sin, and in this case, it is slavery, in the zealous pursuit of which perfectionism and fanaticism is really no vice in their vision. Abolitionists take great pride in their Puritan tradition. They reject the kind of pseudo-genealogy, this kind of blood descent that Confederates try to mark out. But they do, in fact, endorse this notion of the kind of intellectual lineage. Charles Sumner, who's already been on the screen this morning, Sumner is a very careful reader. He's conversant with Mendelian genetics, as many Northerners are, which is just emerging at this point. There's a great newspaper, that sort of Northern newspaper that mocks this notion of the Cavalier descent, and they say something like, it's 1,000 crosses over 1,000 generations, all in pursuit of a heraldic turnip. Right, and they already have the notion of descent, that every generation you cross, and then the sort of attributes. So even if the Normans settle, of course, the kind of bloodlines there distribute out and diffuse out. And Sumner categorically rejects the notion that there's somehow a clear line between the Cavaliers, who he has some respect for, of the 17th century, and the so-called Confederate Cavaliers of the 19th century. Justice is essential as a concept in the Puritan legacy and the ways that 19th century people interpret that legacy, even for conservatives. And I would put here George Bancroft, famous still as historians. The top prize in American history is the Bancroft Prize. Today, Bancroft was a conservative Northerner nationalist. But even here, you see this contrast between the two sides. Chivalry, that is, the Cavalier delighted in outward show, favored pleasure, multiplied amusements, and degraded the human race by an exclusive respect for the privileged classes. Again, this is not a characterization that I think Jefferson Davis would even argue with. Puritanism bridled the passions, commended the virtues of self-denial, and rescued the name of man from dishonor. The former valued country, the latter justice. Puritans planted in their hearts the undying principles of democratic liberty. For Northerners, this intellectual lineage and the encouragement, the kind of commitment to a long pursuit of justice helps fire them for this conflict. So the Confederate and New England perspectives, I would argue, leave relatively little ground for compromise, that is, between sort of fire-eating secessionists and abolitionists from New England. But I will argue that what emerges really not till the start of the war, but that can be seen then in retrospect, is a kind of middle ground adopted by Northern conservatives who are reading the history of the 17th century for its ironies, for its unintended outcomes, and I would argue somewhat more cautiously than the very politicized ways that fire eaters and abolitionists tend to use the 17th century. And so I want to kind of mark out the ways that this third interpretation emerges. And so here there's a little bit of backstory from the 17th century, which I will offer, which is that the English Civil Wars, as Americans called them, actually consisted of three separate rebellions. There is initially a 1637 rebellion in Scotland, promulgated by their anger over the imposition of the Book of Common Prayer by Archbishop Laud, one of Charles I's sort of henchmen. The original blundering generation, as I call them, Laud and Charles I and Stafford, because there is, in fact, an argument that mirrors the kind of historiography on this. And I'm going to leave the Scottish one mostly to the side for the moment, because the other two rebellions are the ones that Americans pay the closest attention to. The first of these is a civil war, really, within England itself, a rebellion against the king and between the king and Parliament, and I'll take up the measure of that in a second. And the third is a rebellion in Ireland, which happens in 1641. The Irish are basically watching what's happening in Scotland, and they're seeing a very distracted England, and they have been under the heel of Stafford, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, appointed by Charles I, who has appropriated land and dispossessed the Catholics and empowered a new generation of Protestant landholders. And so the Irish see an opportunity here to try to create an autonomous Catholic Ireland, and they rebel as well. That rebellion is regarded by the English and by the Americans in the 19th century as an example of illegitimate rebellion. The English rebellion and the English Civil War is really held up as an example of a legitimate or just rebellion, and the Irish as an illegitimate one. And this is, of course, essential for Northerners to differentiate, right? To make an explanation of revolution and rebellion as themselves the descendants of a revolution, to tolerate sort of theoretically revolution, but to be able to parse what are just revolutions from unjust revolutions. So the English Revolution, very quickly. In the 19th century, Americans, drawing mostly on British history, read the English Revolution as a legitimate defense of the people's rights against a king set on usurping them, that is, Charles I. He had refused to call Parliament for a decade. He imposed ship taxes in a way that he hadn't consulted Parliament. There's a sequence of sort of events that promulgate the rebellion in England. And those events Americans take as being the history of that rebellion. It emerges most fully in the writing. The most popular 19th century historian, bar none, is Thomas Macaulay. He's a British historian, enormously popular in the United States. His books go through repeated and pirated printings all over the world. They're translated into Persian. He is enormously widely read in both places. And Macaulay's take here on the king is the sort of standard interpretation. Many English kings had occasionally committed unconstitutional acts, but none had ever systematically attempted to make himself a despot and to reduce the Parliament to a nullity. Such was the end to which Charles distinctly proposed to himself. So in this case, the kind of virtuous English people have no choice but to resist. And this, for Northerners, is a legitimate rebellion. This is a rebellion that prefigures both the glorious revolution of the 1680s and 90s in England, and then later the American Revolution, a revolution for just cause of a people oppressed by a tyrannical government. It demands redress in the sense that in order to fulfill your destiny as a virtuous people, you must resist tyranny here. Harper's Weekly, which recurs to the 17th century continuously, writes in June of 1861, the war has barely begun. We're not yet to Bull Run. Rebellions are not necessarily just or unjust, but hitherto, as they have been generally risings of the people against tyranny, they have inspired sympathy in all generous minds. The Great Rebellion in England was the protest of the English people against the despotic, irresponsible prerogative of the crown. So you see Macaulay's interpretation sort of cemented in the newspaper language in the editorials, trying to grapple with, at the start of the Civil War in particular, this question of, is secession a just rebellion, or is it in fact something more akin to what the Irish do? This is dependent on a host of history texts, and I will save you the time. I've read a lot of them, not quite all of the multi-volumes, but certainly the volumes that deal with the part that I'm interested in. The mid-19th century is awash in histories of the 17th century. These are mostly written by English authors. There's an important biography of Cromwell written by Joel Headley in 1845, but all of these British texts circulate in the United States. They are reviewed in the newspapers. They are widely read. Macaulay is just Macaulay. Everybody knows him. And as one further indication of how deep into the kind of historiography Americans get, the first real history of the 17th century English Civil Wars was written by the Earl of Clarendon. It's called The History of the Rebellion, right, prefiguring our own history of the War of the Rebellion. And Clarendon is used throughout the American Civil War as a sort of shorthand for a historian of rebellion. So a lot of newspapers, I've got 4 or 5 instances of people saying, when we get our Clarendon, we will never understand this conflict until Clarendon writes our history. I was surprised by the degree of kind of sophistication and what we would call historiographical knowledge. The contrary example is the Irish Rebellion of 1641. This is an example for Northerners of an unjust rebellion. The wars themselves are not analogous, and I'm not doing a kind of comparative study in any event. This is intended to be more of what I think of as a kind of connective study. That is, the ideas themselves and how they sort of pull across time, and the ways in particular in which, in the 19th century, using 17th century ideas changes those, just like our contemporary use of the 19th century in a way changes the meaning of that conflict, right? There's a kind of warping effect that happens as we reuse historical analogies and recur to them, something that I've only become sort of conscious of as I've done this. So there's a host of accounts that emphasize the unjustness of English accounts of the unjustness of the Irish Rebellion. Macaulay here, I don't expect you to read the table of contents there. That's from a book called Robert Ross's Outlines of English History, which is for students. The words Irish Rebellion, I've highlighted, occur 3 times in about 6 chapters, and that's notwithstanding chapter titles like Popish Plots and other kinds of things. There's a sense in which the Irish are naturally rebellious, and that the problem of rebellion and of a refusal to obey the kind of dominant order, which is admittedly an imperial one, is endemic in Ireland. It's more the manner of fighting that compels Northerners to this example. So Brodie repeats the language that's used about the Irish Rebellion from particularly Clarendon, but other accounts in the 17th century that view this as a Catholic uprising intent on murdering and persecuting the Protestants. So language like you're seeing here on the screen from George Brodie about the kind of savage nature of Irish warfare, woodcut illustrations that come back into circulation that talk about the history of the Irish conflict as an unjust one. All of these are based on a series of depositions that were taken by the then an administrative officer in Dublin, a guy named John Temple, who compiled a huge history of the Irish Rebellion. Temple's depositions, those depositions have all been digitized at Trinity College. They have a fabulous website. They are akin as a source, I would say, to the WPA slave narratives in the sense that they contain essential primary documentation, but we have to contextualize them very, very carefully before we read them. We do that contextualizing today. Historians today are very careful with Temple's depositions. They are highly propagandistic. In most cases, the numbers are inflated by factors of 10 or often 100. So Brodie, for instance, repeated in his text, as Macaulay does, 40,000 Protestant settlers were killed by the Catholics. The number may be as high as 4,000. It's certainly not 40,000. So we read these depositions quite skeptically today and carefully. In the 19th century, they did not. And it helped convince and to show Americans what an unjust rebellion looked like, and hence the necessity of suppressing that unjust rebellion. So this is an endorsement of England and of what was then sort of the emerging English Empire, would later become the British Empire, in their subjugation of Ireland. And so this is where I want us to kind of think about the transition here for the ways in which Irish perfidy and the violence of the Irish Rebellion demanded the most robust possible response from the English, so too does Confederate perfidy and Confederate atrocity across the Civil War demand from Northerners an equally robust commitment. So I will turn here in the end to just 1 or 2 more minutes, that the notion of hard war, which a bunch of historians, myself included, have written about. We mostly see the evolution of the Northern war strategy as just that, a slow evolution, an ad hoc process of responding to crises on the ground. But I would also argue that there's an intellectual component to this, that there is a justification for a hard and punishing war, and the justification comes from Americans' reading of history, from seeing that the unjustness of the Irish Rebellion is met by an overwhelming English response, which eventually succeeds in subjugating the Irish and bringing it ultimately within the empire. Now, the question of how that works in the long run is chapter 4 of my book, which we can take up in the Q&A, because at the end of the war, in fact, Northerners, conservative Northerners, use that argument to kind of argue against a vindictive peace. But at the start of the war in particular, Northerners are galvanized into a posture that will rebut the Confederacy with all military power available. So I will close here by just noting, returning again to this idea of history as accelerant, not as retardant. When we're in our classrooms, and maybe my colleagues will disagree, but often what we do with students is talk about the possibilities that studying history opens up that we don't see when you commit today's cardinal sin of history, which is teleology. That is a goal-directed history. So we know that the North won the Civil War, so then we write a history that explains how the North won. And in the process, miss that all of that outcome was so contingent. Right? Ed Ayers has probably argued this most carefully in the book that came before The Thin Light of Freedom that's being given out for new members. Second plug for that. I'm on your side, Rob. So instead, history here doesn't serve to open up possibilities. In many respects, history forecloses possibilities. Now, it's a highly politicized reading of history. But what it does is really mobilize people to commit themselves to an increasingly bloody and destructive war. Thank you. So we're moving into Q&A. I think they're going to hand out microphones. There's somebody with their hand at the back, and I'm happy to take any and all questions and queries.
Yes, sir. Could you speak to the role of the fire eaters in galvanizing succession in the southern states?
Yeah, so the question was about fire eaters and their role to galvanize people in the southern states. Rhetoric plays a very important role. I am not a historian who thinks that non-slaveholders were sort of buffaloed into fighting on their behalf. See Eugene Genovese, his article in Ag History on the kind of yeoman. Nonetheless, asking people to fight a war, asking people to give up the country into which they had been born, to go to war against the United States is a very high order. And so it seems to me essential that fire eaters draw on every resource they have at their disposal. And one of these, I would argue, is history. That's what I'm arguing here. I mean, more broadly, of course, they argue that the preservation of slavery and the maintenance of a slave republic is going to be better in the long run for white non-slaveholders than pursuing a free labor agenda or a free labor world of the sort that the Republicans imagine. And there's no question that was appealing, right? For instance, if you look at the correspondence between Alexander Stephens and Howell Cobb, by 1858, 59, they are talking about the possible Republican threat in a kind of electoral sense, that the arguments for free labor will be appealing to white non-slaveholders of the South. And so rhetoric and propaganda is an essential part, particularly in this sort of liminal moment between Lincoln's election, before he's actually done anything, and then when he takes office and can begin actually dismantling slavery or not. And from what we can tell, he was probably not in a position to do that. Manisha described very well, I think, Lincoln's sort of cautious approach to this and very legalistic approach. He was very clear in the 1860 election that he had no power to change slavery as president. And so the result is that the fire eaters have to push people. And by tapping on history as one of the measures by which they do that, I think they broaden that argument. They obscure slavery, they make secession look less sort of mercenary and less defensive of their property alone.
Thanks for that excellent presentation. My question is, during the Washington Peace Conference of was it February or so before Lincoln actually took office, were these arguments advanced by the proponents, or were the proponents of the peace conference trying to take that middle ground and push back on the cultural arguments that you just advanced?
You're talking about the beginning of the war.
Right, the Washington Peace Conference at the beginning.
Yeah.
Before Lincoln actually was inaugurated.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't see, no, the arguments, the kind of northern moderate line that I'm arguing emerges really over the course of the war. I mean, I think you can see it in 1861 as they start positioning particularly a kind of English rebellion and Irish rebellion as these two poles here. But it takes some time because the northern moderates are trying to thread a very difficult needle in the sense that the popular history really does celebrate Cavaliers versus Puritans. And so, northern conservatives who denounce Lincoln as Cromwell with probably more vigor than Confederates denounce Lincoln as Cromwell. That's why I started this project, was seeing how often Lincoln is compared to Cromwell as a military tyrant. Northern conservatives will say Lincoln's like Cromwell. On the other hand, they will also admit Charles I was a despotic king. And this is a very difficult argument to make sort of in the context of a war. So I don't see it in that kind of strategic, tactical sense, I guess I should say, at the moment at the beginning of the war. It's something that emerges more fully. I thought you were asking for a second. Famously at Hampton Roads, at the quasi-peace conference, the meeting of Confederate commissioners in February of 1865, when Alexander Stephens and Campbell and some others come up and meet with Lincoln and Seward and others to try to propose peace terms. This is a non-starter from the beginning, but Archibald, I think it's Campbell, one of the Confederate commissioners, actually raises in this conversation the example of the English Civil Wars. And he says, basically, don't forget how generous Charles II was with his former enemies. And Lincoln says, I'm not well versed in history. You should consult Seward for that. I do seem to recall that Charles lost his head. It's like the world's biggest diplomatic blunder is to sort of say to Lincoln, hey, you should emulate Charles's behavior. And of course, Lincoln loses his head, 3 months later. So it's a kind of eerie premonition. But that was an example for me of the ways in which the analogy is actually deep in the Civil War that we haven't really appreciated, that it's there at Hampton Roads. Edward Everett makes extensive reference to it at Gettysburg. Right? Lincoln's speech is the one we know. Edward Everett was the main speaker of the day. And Everett is deeply immersed in history. He had been for decades. And he talks at length in a similar way about the importance of being generous in peace. Everett is a kind of northern conservative from Massachusetts, old line Whig, and his argument is very much generous terms. I mean, he's making basically the Charles II argument, but not to Lincoln himself, which was probably wise. Maybe since Kelly's got the microphone, we'll do one there, and then we'll come out here and here.
Thank you. This is another one from the live stream. And could you elaborate on the role that religion played in the cultural origins of the Civil War and in prolonging the war?
Yeah, so the role of religion in creating and prolonging it. I don't think that the Civil War was a religious war in the sense that it was not caused by theological arguments. though the arguments about slavery and about slavery's morality or about slavery as a truly Christian practice are, of course, deeply theological, and those were deeply divisive arguments. It is principally, I would argue, a political conflict over the future of slavery, but the religious framing, like the historical framing, is key, I think, to mobilizing people on both sides. Ministers played, as we know from a variety of studies, a kind of essential role in mediating and explaining the war. And I argued, so the book that Rob mentioned, Calculus of Violence, tries to take stock of the patterns of violence. And one of the things I found there was that, especially in the North, but also in the South, Christian ministers, who should theoretically be dedicated to a kind of pacifistic posture, if they're kind of clear in their reading in the New Testament, find very effective ways to argue for vigorous and hard war. In many cases, for the virtues of war as a kind of purifying force. That is, they become more Old Testament in some of their readings. So I think there are ways in which religion did, in fact, exacerbate the violence of the war and extended the war, certainly as a rhetoric that enshrined this sense of cultural difference between the North and the South. Religion is important. I think if you had brought a visitor here from another country who didn't speak English very well in 1860, they would have had a very hard time distinguishing a Northern Presbyterian from a Southern Presbyterian. If you'd explained slavery, they would have understood that. But if you were trying to kind of parse out some kind of innate sectional difference in theological or cosmological grounds, I think that would have been extremely difficult to do. We can do it today because we've got 60,000 books about the Civil War, and we've, bore down on these problems with kind of incredible detail. On the other hand, I would say, and then we can move on to another question, on this question of violence, I do think that it is in some measure, I was talking to a gentleman here a minute ago about the decision by African Americans, particularly enslaved people during the war, to pursue their freedom and not to pursue vengeance, which is, I think, the most important factor limiting violence in the Civil War by several orders of magnitude. We would have seen a death total 2 or 3 times what was produced had there been a genuine servile insurrection of the sort that Jefferson Davis is claiming is coming. That the decision to pursue freedom and not vengeance in some measure is owed to an Afro-Christianity that is wedded to a kind of New Testament vision of charity that doesn't seek to sort of spread violence needlessly. I don't think that's the only explanation, and I think we need more research to kind of understand that process. It seems to me one of the great kind of hidden mechanisms of the war that we don't have a clear handle on yet. There were some more questions up here in the front, right here, yeah.
So thank you for such an enlightening aspect. So the same sort of 17th century forces and legacy that formulated opinion in the U.S., how did those same sort of opinions influence the debate in England during the war regarding participation in the U.S. conflict, since it was much more tender to them probably than to us?
Yeah, that's a great question about how the English are doing this. So, it's a room full of Americanists, I can generally assume, and that is there's no British historian out there because I don't want them to hear what I'm going to say, which is that I think, that's true, not the 17th century. You just say? Carry on. I'm going to argue that the English changed their understanding of rebellion as a result of the American Civil War. So the English are engaged in this debate as well, and there are editorials in the London Times and in Scottish papers and other places in which they are thinking about, just as Americans are, thinking about the American conflict in light with the 17th century. And I think that there is a kind of subtle transformation. Certainly there is a change in the treatment of Cromwell. So Cromwell's rehabilitation, Cromwell had been public enemy number 1 in England all the way through right after the Restoration. His body, he had died of natural causes. His body is dug up, quartered, and then sent to the winds. There's a college, I think at Cambridge, that claims that his skull is sort of still under the floor there. But it gives you some measure of how angry they were. In the 1840s, there was a kind of rehabilitation of Cromwell. Thomas Carlyle famously edits a collection of his speeches, and then you start to get historians, Robert Vaughan, English historian, and others that are changing and reading Cromwell as a necessary protector of liberty, as somebody who advanced in a very teleological, so I'm not endorsing this line of thinking, that English Whiggish tradition of liberty, that the English above all in the world sort of began in the 17th century a tradition of preserving individual liberty. Cromwell helped that. Then it is perfected in the Glorious Revolution. And what's interesting is that Americans pick this up as well and say, it was not quite perfected then because we improved it in the rebellion, and now in the Civil War it's being brought to its fulfillment. And so the American endorsement of Cromwell, Wendell Phillips refers to Cromwell continuously. He is a huge Cromwell fan. And I do think that the American discourse kind of reverberates back to England and changes the way that they understand their history. This is what I think I would have a hard time convincing a British historian of. What I would argue is that American historians have, at least of the Civil War, have begun to consider that outside forces played a role in our conflict. It wasn't all just within the bounds of the United States. So maybe the same thing is true in England. From what I can tell, that's not probably going to be a popular argument. So.
This likely will be our last question, so hopefully you can ask Aaron after the break.
Okay.
On the question of evolving historiography, how are you building on the work of Bill Taylor's Cavalier and Yankee?
Yeah, so the question is about Cavalier and Yankee, Bill Taylor's famous study, which probably a lot of you have read. I would argue that that book is largely a kind of literary study. And what I'm trying to do is more historical in the sense of not how these are tropes that are sort of deployed, although they are that also, but the history as Americans at the time understood it. And in particular, I would pay attention to the title of Taylor's book, because his book is titled Cavalier and Yankee, which seems to me to make it commits an error, which is to translate into the vernacular of the 19th century, when what I'm talking about is Cavalier and Puritan. And the Puritan was a concept that Northerners endorsed, particularly New England abolitionists, but others as well. And so I think paying careful attention to the ways that Americans understood history, just as we do, we use history to navigate our lives. And so the question is, how did Civil War Americans use history to navigate their lives? I'm not suggesting this is the only thing. The obvious question is, why aren't you doing the American Revolution, since that's a much more proximate history? And I think that story needs to be done because I don't think that we've actually adequately reckoned with the ways in which memories of the Revolution, not in the kind of nationalist sense, right? We often talk about historical memory in the sense solely of a kind of cultural nationalism. And in a way, my story is about the kind of academic use, the use of history as an intellectual discipline, which allows you to establish analytical frameworks, compare cause and effect, sequence outcomes. Americans are doing that even before there is actually a historical profession. The professional of history that we belong to is really a function of the 1880s and the 1890s. But nonetheless, what I think I'm seeing here are the kind of antecedents of that, of people thinking through history. So, thank you all.